Welcome to another episode of the Re-Federalist Report. I am Brady, also known as a war hamster. Joining me is just back from a very long and arduous trip, my good friend, constitutional mentor, Mr. Constitution himself, Douglas V. Gibbs.
Thanks for having me.
Good to be back in the saddle?
Oh, absolutely. Good to be home. Hotel bed's only, You always like your own bed. Your own shower,
I hear you. Well, we are today going to continue of our review of James Madison's notes from the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, where the Constitution was written. Why are we doing this, Doug?
Well, when it comes to studying the original intent of the Constitution, and especially the context, it's always best to, it's like if you want to understand a contract or you want to understand a council meeting, what do? You go back to the minutes. And that's really what we're doing. And the discussions really open up quite a wide avenue of explaining what they meant, because we hear both sides.
Yeah, you really did. Not just both sides. You hear a bunch of different sides. I mean, they threw a lot of really interesting ideas. And last week was a great example. One of the big debates last week is they were trying to figure out whether the Senate should be elected every 3, 5, or 7 years. And,
all of which didn't happen.
Yeah, a lot of it did. They did agree on 7 years, though. But we'll get into that. It's funny. I was listening to Brian McClanahan, one of the recent shows. If you guys don't know McClanahan, go look him up, Brion McClanahan on YouTube. He's a great constitutionalist. I listen to him very regularly. He was talking about, he was reviewing some recent article that talked about Amy Coney Barrett and her brand of originalism.
Yeah, I've got that. Matter of fact, I got that article bookmarked. I haven't read it yet.
McClanahan makes the point that you don't have a brand of originalism. There's just originalism.
Right.
And he goes in, really does a good job of going into the difference between a textualist and an originalist.
And I read about that not long ago, yeah.
Yeah, and Doug and I most certainly are original intent constitutionalists. And the only way to get to know what the original intent was is to listen to the words of the people who wrote the darn document. So, with no further ado, let's jump in. I'm getting ready to share my screen. And here we are at the Avalon Project. As you guys both know, we left off on June 12th, Tuesday. This is the calendar of the convention, and we're going to jump into June 13th. So you can tell it's going to be a long exercise. Hopefully we get through 3 episodes today, or 3 days.
Well, they're meeting pretty regularly now.
So we're on Wednesday, June 13th, 1787, in the Committee of the Whole. They were talking about resolution number 9 being resumed. The latter parts, real quick, resolution number 9 refers to the Virginia plan. And got that right here. Resolution 9 had to do with the national judiciary. Mr. Randolph and Mr. Madison then moved the following resolution respecting a national judiciary: that the jurisdiction of the national, this is important here, that the national judiciary shall extend to cases which respect the collection of the national revenue, impeachments of any national officers, and questions which involve the national peace and harmony, which was agreed to. That last little piece, that last bit of that sentence is a little bit open-ended. You want to comment on that?
Of the one with Mr. Randolph and Mr. Madison?
The national peace and harmony. They're talking about the jurisdiction of what the federal judiciary is going to have.
National peace and harmony. It's funny because they were dealing with, right after what really brought this up was Shays' Rebellion. And I think that might be what they're referring to. Peace and the national peace and harmony. Shays' Rebellion became basically the matchstick for what led to the Annapolis Convention and ultimately this convention to create the Constitution. And I'm guessing that, but
I think you're right.
And there's probably more, but I'm guessing that's what it's about. And once we even became a country, I want to say this real quick, only because it also ties in some stuff that's going on right now. George Washington actually had to get the militia because of the Whiskey Rebellion. So peace and harmony was a big deal. And while the president, ultimately under the Constitution, could not just go into a state for just anything without permission from the legislature or the governor, if the legislature could not be convened, when it came to certain items, the president could, and the president did, especially when it came to executing federal law, in which the Whiskey Rebellion, whether it was good law or bad law is not the point. It wasn't being executed, and there was a rebellion and attack against the tax collectors regularly as a result. And let me say this. There's a precedent for taking the militia, which we today call the National Guard, that'd be the organized militia, or at least part of it, into action to, bring about national peace and harmony. But anyway, go ahead.
My issue with the sentence is it's very open-ended, because we very well know that a 20th century judge or judiciary will turn around and say, "Oh, national peace and harmony, that can be just about anything we want to rule on."
Oh, sure.
It reminds me of general welfare clause, and that is my criticism of the Constitution, because they were never going to get it perfect. I mean, it just human civilization is far too complex. But if we were to sit down and rewrite it, there's a few areas where we'd be a little bit more specific than they currently are, and get rid of these judiciary interpretations.
Well, I think in an effort to be concise, they left out some of the language that was in articles of Confederation, would appear in was in the Virginia state constitution, and so on and so forth. That would have been better suited. So yeah, I agree.
Which is exactly why we focus on original intent, and these darn textualists, they pervert it. So Pinckney and Sherman moved to insert the words "one supreme tribunal," or to insert after the words "one supreme tribunal" the words "the judges of which to be appointed by the national legislature." So right now they're proposing that our Supreme Court and other federal judges are appointed by Congress.
And isn't that nice that that's not the case? Mm-hmm. Because with all the ideas of in our history, recent and the last century, of packing the court, well, Congress would have been very easily able to do that, and if that were the case.
Well, so Mr. Madison's about to argue against it, and as you'll see below, Pinckney and Sherman.
Yeah, it's funny. It says Sherman up and Sherman here. How do you get two spellings the same name within a couple paragraphs? But anyway, go ahead.
All right. Madison objects to an appointment by the whole legislature. His reasoning is interesting. He says many of them were incompetent judges of the requisite qualifications. Just because you're a congressman doesn't, you're a member of the House doesn't mean you have the ability to, judge what the qualifications are. They were too much influenced by their partialities. The candidate who is present, who had displayed a talent for business in a legislative field, who had perhaps assisted ignorant members in business of his own, or of their constituents, or used other winning means, would, without any of the essential qualifications, for an expositor of the laws, prevail over a competitor not having these recommendations, but possessed of every necessary accomplishment. What he's saying is Congress is going to appoint people that are good politicians instead of people that are good judges, who actually have legal accomplishment. That's his argument. He proposed the appointment should be made by the Senate, the senior austere body, which as a less numerous and more select body would be more competent judges, and which has sufficiently numerous to justify such confidence in them. What do you think about that argument?
I think he's right. Of course, it goes deeper than that, but I think he's on the right track. Remember, the U.S. Senate, originally being appointed by state legislatures, acted as sort of like a pseudo aristocracy. These are people who were well versed and well skilled in the science of politics. They were trusted by the state legislatures. They'd been around a while. They understood the system. They understood the law better than someone who might have been elected from a congressional district who's just, pardon the way that I'm putting this, but Joe Blow from the street who has no experience.
Or a bartender,
that's the way
bartender from Brooklyn.
or a bartender from Brooklyn. Yeah. So I understand the argument. Now, that said, ultimately, that's not what they went with, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, but it's interesting that Madison made the argument and everyone changed. Hey, that's a good argument. We'll buy that. And now everyone's agreed.
And you got to realize that Madison had a pretty persuasive way of debating. Jefferson, not in this convention, but was also one of those types of people. Unfortunately, so was Alexander Hamilton. Continue.
We haven't heard much about Hamilton yet. We will.
Well, you got to realize now he's there at this point. But you got to realize also there's going to be a point after the 6th week mark where he walks out with John Lansing and Robert Yates. Now he comes back as the lone representative of New York, but he's actually gone for a while at one point. But anyway, go ahead.
All right. So Mr. Gary continues, and we move to restrain the senatorial branch from originating money bills. Interesting, huh?
Yeah, well, and as we know from Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution, money bills or bills regarding revenue can only come out of the House of Representatives, the voice of the people. Once again, well, we'll see what they've got to say, but there was a fear that the aristocracy, the pseudo-aristocracy of the Senate, or the federal government itself would just spend. They wanted the people's voice to be involved.
Yeah, the problem with that is what they've done just in modern day is you look at Obamacare. That bill was initiated in the Senate, and obviously the Supreme Court called it a tax, so it is a money bill. They basically just say, we'll just take an old Congress, something Congress, the House did send, and we'll rewrite the entire thing and say it was started in the House. So
we amended it by stripping all the language and putting ours in.
All of it.
Yeah.
The other branch was more immediately representative of the people, and it was a maxim that the people ought to hold the purse strings. And obviously this made it
and think about this for a second. If you have a runaway government and the people's upset about this runaway government, what's the best way to stop it? Strip it of its money.
Mm-hmm.
That's the argument.
Well, that's what's going on right this second in D.C.
Yep.
I really hope that some of these cuts are permanent. But that's going to be a fun legal battle.
That's the reason I'm excited about shutdown. I actually wrote an article about it, but since my website right now is still not accepting my articles, go to Canada Free Press for those of you looking for my articles.
I'm told that the website will be very much functional on Monday. So that's some good news. If the Senate should be allowed to originate such bills, they would repeat the experiment till chance should furnish a set of representatives in the other branch who will fall into their snares.
In other words, if you don't succeed with the tyranny, try again till you get the right combination of dice. You're just rolling the dice until our right representatives show up in the House. Mr.
Butler saw no reason for such a discrimination. We were always following the British Constitution. When the reason of it did not apply. There was no analogy between the House of Lords and the body proposed to be established. If the Senate should be degraded by such discriminations, the best men would be apt to decline serving in it in favor of the other branch. And it will lead the latter into the practice of tacking other clauses to money bills. Now, that is a very interesting paragraph.
A little prophetic.
Mm-hmm. But he goes away from the analogy with the House of Lords, and that's really not the prevailing thought there. They really kind of modeled it after that.
Well, there's this idea we don't have a nobility, but that doesn't mean that you don't have a pseudo nobility. That we have today, for example, the Clintons and the Obamas and the Bidens, and in a sense, that is like Pelosi's a pseudo nobility. So I want people to understand that while we're trying not to be a monarchy, a lot of those aspects kind of naturally wind up popping up because that's what tyrants do. That's what people seeking power do. And I remind people all the time in my speeches, who seeks office in a system where holding office is a type of power. those seeking power. And so who are you going to get in office? A bunch of people seeking power. And that's where it's so important for us to be involved, because we have to counterbalance that.
Yeah, and that's why it's so interesting. Butler makes two predictions here. The first is says if the Senate doesn't get to have the ability to launch bills that don't have to do with money, then no one's going to want to be a senator because the House has more power and they're going to run for that instead. Well, that didn't happen. That's not the case. That was a bad prediction.
Because the Senate was given other powers, and largely because they're the oversight by the states originally.
But his prediction that did go correct was it will lead to the latter, the practice of tacking other clauses to money bills, and that's what we call pork, which absolutely happened. Madison observed, Madison's become one of the most verbose in the last few days. He observed that the commentators on a British constitution, which doesn't exist, had not yet agreed on the reason of the restriction of the House of Lords in money bills.
Well, real quick, for those of you, that's an interesting comment. The British Constitution existed, but didn't. It wasn't written. The British Constitution was the ideas that came forth from the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Rights, and other documents, or English common law. English common law being a law that's not written down, but it's understood by everybody. It's influenced by the whims of the populace, but where it does get codified is through the rulings of judges, because it's living and breathing. Sound familiar what they're trying to do with the Constitution? But so that's the British Constitution. That's what they're referring to when they say the British Constitution.
And it's worked out so well that they're arresting people for Facebook memes this minute. Mm-hmm. And this is this is the argument for the American Bill of Rights. Although I would argue against it, but that's a different story for another day. Certain it was that there could be no similar reason in the case before us. The Senate would be the representatives of the people as well as the first branch. Senate's supposed to be the representative of the states. If they should have any dangerous influence over it, they could easily prevail on some member of the latter to originate the bill they wish to be passed. The senator can walk down the hall, talk to his member of the House of Representatives, and say, hey, I need you to propose this. That's what he's saying. As the Senate would be generally a more capable set of men, it would be wrong to disable them from any preparation of the business, especially of that which was most important, and in our republics, worse prepared than any other. Talking about money. The gentleman, in pursuance of his principle, ought to carry the restraint to the amendment, as well as the originating of money bills, since an addition of a given sum would be equivalent to a distinct proposition of it. It's talking about amending money bills, which is what goes on today. Mr. King differed from Mr. Gary and concurred in the objections to the proposition. Mr. Reed favored the proposition, but would not extend the restraint to the case of amendments. So they can't initiate, Reed's saying you can't initiate money bills, but you can amend it, which may make some sense. Mr. Pinckney thinks the question is premature. If the Senate should be formed on the same proportional representation as it stands at present, they should have equal power. Otherwise, if a different principle should be introduced.
And once again, this is kind of there's an argument here on what to do, because you got to remember, under the Articles of Confederation, under the Declaration of Independence, you had a single house. You had the Continental Congress, or the Congress of the Confederation. It was a single house. And while the number of delegates by each state may differ here and there, the votes were one per state. But yet they're looking at successful republics in history, two of them being the British and the Roman Empire. They had two houses, and the two houses differ from each other. You have a House of Lords and a House of Commons, or you have the Senate and the Assembly in Rome, and they differed from each other, and they're going to work this out and recognize that that's a good thing. But right now, you got many of these guys are still hung up on, we have one single house. We're going to have two houses. They need to be same. But then again, why have two houses? You can have one. And they're kind of hung up on all that. So we'll see. We'll see the change ultimately. Go ahead.
Yeah, really good point. He's Sherman again. The Sherman is gone. If you guys haven't been watching this whole thing, Madison keeps spelling Sherman's name either Charmin or Sherman, and there's no consistency, rhyme, or
His
reason
E
to it.
looks like an A, and that's what they decided to type, one or the other.
That's entirely possible. As both branches must concur, there can be no danger whichever way the Senate be formed. We established two branches in order to get more wisdom, which is particularly needed in the finance business. The Senate bear their share of the taxes and are also representatives of the people. What a man does by another, he does by himself is a maxim. In Kant, don't know what that abbreviation is, both branches can originate in all cases. And it has been found safe and convenient. I think he's talking about Connecticut. And that would make sense because that's where he's from. Whatever might have been the reason of the rule to the House of Lords, it is clear that no good arises from it now, even there. So he's arguing for the Senate to be able to initiate.
To be just like the House when it comes to the money bills.
Exactly. Pinckney says this distinction prevails in South Carolina and has been a source of pernicious disputes between ye two branches. The Constitution is now evaded by informal schedules of amendments handed from ye Senate to the other House. So he's saying we have that distinction in South Carolina and it's causing problems. Mr. Williamson wishes for a question chiefly to prevent rediscussion. The restriction will have one advantage. It will oblige some member in lower branch to move, and people can then mark him. Not quite sure what Williams is saying there. Make any sense to you?
Yeah, I don't know if when he says to move, if he means to make a motion or if he means to move, be gone. But I think he means to move or make a motion, and then it has to be considered rather than just easily moving forward. But anyway, go ahead.
So they take a vote on the question for accepting money bills as proposed by Mr. Gary, and the noes win the day. So as of right now, the Senate can initiate bills to do with finance. That was their decision on the floor as of this day. Committee rose, and Mr. Gorham makes his report, which was postponed till tomorrow to give an opportunity for other plans to be proposed. The report was in the words following. This is basically what has been resolved so far. And I'm going to go through these pretty quick, okay, since we've already done these over the last several episodes. Mm-hmm. One, it's been resolved that the opinion of the Committee of a National Government ought to be established, consisting of the Supreme, Legislative, Executive, and Judiciary. Resolved, the National Legislature ought to consist of two branches. They've already decided that. Some of these resolutions that are there right now won't make it through to the final copy, so keep that in mind. Resolved that the members of the first branch ought to be elected by the people for a term of 3 years to receive fixed stipends, compensation, blah, 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 ought to be paid out of the Treasury, and to be ineligible to any office established by a state, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, the 3 years didn't make it.
Yeah, and that one part is important. You can't double dip. If you're a member of one part of government, you can't be a member of another part of government.
Indeed. It's resolved that the members of the second branch, which is the Senate, ought to be chosen by the individual legislatures to be of 30 years old to hold their offices for a term sufficient to ensure their independency, namely 7 years. There's that again. Most of this made it to the final copy, though, because they have resolved to have the senators be appointed by the state legislature, and that's the important part. Number 5 is resolved that each branch ought to possess the right of originating acts. And we just voted on the amendment to that, the one limit, to have it do with financial acts. It's already been resolved that the national legislature ought to be empowered to enjoy the legislative rights vested in Congress by the Confederation, which means under the Articles of Confederation, it's already there, or moreover to legislate in all cases in which the separate states are incompetent, meaning it needs the federal government to step in, or in which the harmony of the U.S. may be interrupted by the exercise of individual legislation. Here's the big one here. To negative all laws passed by the several states contravening, in the opinion of the national legislature, the Articles of Union, or any treaties subsisting under the authority of the Union. Once again, we're back to the federal negative of state laws.
Yeah, that's federal supremacy on steroids.
Yeah, and that's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
We have that now, even though it's not in the Constitution.
Right.
Thanks to your 14th Amendment being misinterpreted.
Yep.
I'm doing a show tomorrow with Colonel Tanner Watkins. We're going to be talking about Lincoln's counterfeiters and Lincoln's spies. And I got to talk a little bit about Samuel P. Chase in there when it comes to counterfeiters.
That's a name I've heard quite a few times.
Yeah, well, I've done a lot of research into Chase. He's a doozy. But his interpretation.
You're saying that nicely.
Yeah, well, well, he was this Chief Justice in the slaughterhouse cases, and he got overruled by the majority because he was a nationalist without a doubt.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Resolved that the rights of suffrage in the first branch of the national legislature ought not to be according to the rule established in the Articles of Confederation, but according to some equitable ratio of representation, population based. And it's
got to remember the state decided how many delegates they sent, but in the end, the state only got one vote, and the number of delegates was up to the state on how to do it. And they're saying, well, it needs to be a little bit more uniform here, is what they're getting at. Go ahead.
And here we get the 3/5 compromise and Indians not taxed. This language is almost verbatim in the Constitution. Resolve the right of suffrage in the second branch of the national legislature, the Senate, ought to be according to the rule established for the first, which the 17th Amendment actually ended up doing, unfortunately.
Ultimately.
Yeah.
Now, right of suffrage, for those of you not familiar with the language, suffrage is representation.
Yep. And again, it's one of our ongoing arguments, even whether we're talking about Reynolds v. Sims or the Second Amendment. The states have to have, the states are entities that need representation. Right. If you make the whole thing population-based, the big cities are going to dominate the rural areas. And you've got to protect the big from the small and the small from the big. That's the balance.
Unfortunately, as democracy has creeped through our system, this idea of one person, one vote, and while that's important when it's time for voting, that doesn't mean that every part needs to be based on voting. A republic is not just one person, one vote. That may be great for the House of Representatives, but for other parts of the government, they did it differently because it was about a distribution of power that didn't give too much power to any one group, and that included we the people. Please continue. That's
also the best way to protect a minority.
Mm-hmm. Especially when you got the majority populations in the cities. And the rural voice, those who live in rural areas, very different from those who live in the cities.
And as Doug likes to say, you don't want people in the city telling you how to farm, and you don't want people in the farm telling people how to run a city.
Exactly.
Resolved that a national executive be instituted to consist of a single person, to be chosen by the national legislature for the term of 7 years. Well, none of that happened. With the power to carry into execution the national laws, to appoint to offices in cases not otherwise provided for, to be eligible a second time, and to be removable on impeachment and conviction of malpractices or neglect of duty, to receive a fixed stipend, blah, blah, blah.
And a lot of that did make it in.
Yeah, a lot of it, but not all. And
right.
Let's talk about the President of the United States, the executive branch, which they did not have under the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, the presidents that they had under the Articles of Confederation was like a prime minister in Britain, where he was a member of the legislature. He was the senior member of the legislature.
And he served for 1 year.
Yeah, he served for 1 year. So they were still kind of in a parliamentary mindset. But Montesquieu was heavily influential when it came to separation of powers. And to do that, that president, the prime minister or whatever, need to be removed from the legislature and be a separate office. And that's what's going on here.
They did use the term president at the time, but George Washington is still the first president of the United States as we understand it today. Because with that comes...
There are 9 people before George Washington that held an office called president, John Hanson being technically the first one. But under the Constitution and as an executive, that's what you're saying, as an executive, is the president prior or like a prime minister.
Yeah, prior I would spell president with a non-capitalized P, and then current
Right.
is a capital P.
I agree with that. Yeah, that's a good way of doing it.
All right, resolved that the national executive shall have the right to negative any legislative act which shall not be afterwards passed unless 2/3 of the vote of each branch. That's the veto. And that basically came through intact. 2/3. It's resolved that a national judiciary be established to consist of one supreme tribunal and judges of which to be appointed by the second branch of the national legislature, which they just discussed, to hold their offices during good behavior, etc., etc. So that's been resolved. Now that would be changed soon. It's resolved that the national legislature be empowered to appoint inferior tribunals.
That went into the Constitution. It's actually mentioned twice.
Mm-hmm. And it makes perfect sense. That's a logical one.
And when we say inferior tribunals, what they're talking about, circuit courts, district courts, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Which is fine as long as they don't start trying to give federal negatives of state laws, which they did.
Or universal injunctions.
I don't see. Did they talk about universal injunctions in this convention at all, Doug?
I don't believe so, but there was discussions about the powers of the courts, and there were actually those that argued, I don't even think we should have a federal court system. That discussion was there. The fear of judicial review was there, but ultimately the courts were established largely because of, as the argument went, maritime law, international law, in which the cases in which the federal government might be a party, disputes between the states, things like that.
It's that last one that's so important, the disputes between the states or people from other states. And that's where the encroachment happens. But we'll get to that. We're going to spend a lot of time on judicial review during this exercise. So let's hold our fire for now. Because you and I both are going to have a lot of thunder and fire on that one.
Yeah, I like how you said that. Hold our fire.
Yeah. Resolved that the jurisdiction of the national judiciary shall extend to all cases with respect to the collection of national revenue, impeachments of any naval officers, and questions which involve national peace and harmony. It's resolved that provision ought to be made for the admission of states lawfully arising from within the limits of the United States, whether from a voluntary junction of government and territory, adding new states, which is we did have a provision for in the Constitution. It's resolved that provision ought to be made for the continuance of Congress and their authorities and privileges until a given day after the reform of the Articles of Union shall be adopted for the completion of their engagements. Yeah, not that important. It's a big one here. Big one. Resolved that a Republican Constitution and its existing laws ought to be guaranteed to each state by the United States. Article 4, Section 4 in this document guarantees a Republican form of government, which means we're not a democracy. They knew that then. They should know it now.
You know, it's funny because I received a survey from the Trump administration. One of the questions was, do you believe our democracy is in danger? And rather than answer the question, I crossed out democracy and wrote republic. We'll see how they receive that.
Once you start using the language of the left, you've already lost the argument.
Yeah.
Oh, I love 16. I could read this one over and over again. All right. 17, resolved that provision ought to be made for the amendment of the Articles of Union whensoever it shall seem necessary. This is important because one of the biggest issues with the Articles of Confederation is it took unanimous approval of all states to make any changes. So that was a problem.
One state disagrees, we can't get anything done. It almost sounds like the Senate with cloture, but anyway.
Yeah, Rhode Island could just sit there and say no to everything. Oh, wait, they did that, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
Because they were settled by a bunch of smugglers and counterfeiters. They wanted almost
smugglers, counterfeits, pirates, and slave traders.
We love you, Rhode Island. Interesting, that's where the robber barons built all their mansions in Newport. Resolved that the legislative, executive, and judiciary powers within the several states ought to be bound by oath to support the Articles of Union. That didn't quite make it through. I mean, you do swear an oath to the Constitution, but I don't think that's quite what this is saying. Is it, or is it not?
They actually are. Article 6, it says, is almost that exact language.
Okay. Resolved that the amendments which shall be offered to the Confederation by the Convention ought at a proper time or times after the approbation of Congress to be submitted to an assembly or assemblies recommended by the several legislatures to be expressly chosen by the people to consider and decide thereon. That's the ratification process. Okay, so that's what's been resolved so far. We're going to go to June 14th. Mr. Patterson of New Jersey, this is William Patterson, and if we had more time, I'd give you a bio on him. Maybe we'll do that next time. He observed to the convention that it was a wish of several deputations, particularly that of New Jersey, that further time might be allowed them to contemplate the plan, which is the Virginia plan, reported from the Committee of the Whole, which I just read, or we just read, and to digest one purely federal and contra-distinguished from the reported plan. He said they hope to have such a one ready tomorrow to be laid before the convention, and the convention adjourned that leisure might be given for that purpose.
Now, this is important. Here's what it's saying. A, we're still thinking about the Virginia plan. We're not sure it's a good plan, and New Jersey's saying we might have our own plan with some altered ideas. The other key point here is the convention is not meeting. It is meeting. It's just not meeting there. Hence the pubs and so on and so forth. The discussions over a beer or two or three or four or five.
Yeah, the 5 delegates from New Jersey are going to have a very busy day celebrating Bastille Day. Oh, wait, Bastille Day didn't exist yet. Actually, it's July 14th. I read it wrong, not June 14th. My bad. Bad joke.
Bastille didn't exist.
True. So we get to June 15th, and we get the introduction of the New Jersey plan. And I wanted to do the other stuff so quickly because...
Now, and real quick before we do this. Now, understand, the Virginia plan is written by Madison, and it favors states like Virginia with huge populations. New Jersey is a state that has a smaller population. Oh, whoa, wait a second. This isn't good for us small states. We've got to have something in there that protects our interests and gives us a voice. And it's funny because Madison was one of the toughest ones to convince regarding this, but yet once he understood it, he was one of the biggest defenders. And one of, and I bring this up often in my speeches and discussions on radio programs, Federalist paper number 10, he lays it out that the best way to control the factions is to set them against each other, which means the minority factions have to have a larger voice so that they can be set against those majority factions so that there can be compromise. So this is what we're getting ready to dip our toes into. Okay, go ahead.
And before I jump in, just remind everybody, we also had seen the South Carolina plan of Charles Pinckney, had some other interesting ones. This is more editing, kind of finer points of Virginia plan. The New Jersey plan is going to be even more of a divergence. Now, there's some good parts of the Virginia plan, without a doubt, and some of it got adopted.
Right. And I'd say even most of it got adopted, but the New Jersey plan, definitely tried to temper a lot of what would favor the larger states. Of course, the problem with the New Jersey plan is it may have gone a little too far in favoring the rural states or the smaller states by population. But we'll talk about Mr. Sherman and Connecticut later. Okay, go ahead.
So this is Patterson of New Jersey. He laid before the convention the plan, which he said several of the deputations wished to be substituted in place of the proposed by Mr. Randolph. That's the Virginia plan. Mm-hmm. After some little discussion of the most proper mode of giving it a fair deliberation, it was agreed that it should be referred to the Committee of the Whole, and that in order to place the two plans in due comparison, the other should be recommitted. At the earnest desire of Mr. Lansing and some other gentlemen, it was also agreed that the convention should not go into committee of the whole on the subject till tomorrow, by which delay the friends of the plan proposed by Mr. Patterson would be better prepared to explain it and support it, and all would have an opportunity of taking copies.
Mr. Lansing being mentioned here is important. He's from New York. And remember, they're still under the assumption that we're going to fix the Articles of Confederation. Lansing and some other gentlemen, Robert Yates would be some of those other gentlemen, are beginning to realize we're not fixing the Confederation. We're starting to work on something totally new. And they are beginning to squirm about it.
All right, so real quick, before I jump into this, the Avalon project is really good. It was going to give us 3 different variants, and I was going to read from them. And I clicked on variant A. Oh, it's no longer there. I clicked on variant B of the New Jersey plan. Oh, it's no longer there. Then I clicked on C. Guess what I'm going to find out? It's no longer there. Something's going on with the archives. Have you seen that before on Avalon?
No.
Yeah. Well, keep an eye on it. Okay. It says resolved that the Articles of Confederation, this is Doug just said, the Articles of Confederation ought to be so revised, corrected, and enlarged so as to render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. It says, this is why we're here, this is what we're doing, but we're just revising the Articles. So it's really split on. They haven't reached the conclusion that we got to toss the whole thing out yet.
That happens about the 6th week. We're what, about 5 weeks in?
Hang on. We're probably the 3rd real active week. So
5th week if you want to count the first 2 days as weeks because they were on different weeks, but okay.
This is a long one. Resolved that in addition to the powers vested in the U.S. Congress by the present existing Articles of Confederation, that they be authorized to pass acts for raising a revenue by levying a duty or duties on all goods and merchandises of foreign growth or manufacture imported into any part of the United States, by stamps on paper, vellum, or parchment, and by a postage on all letters or packages passing through the General Post Office, to be applied for such federal purposes as they shall deem proper and expedient. You know what's missing from that? An income tax.
Good observation.
If the government has limited powers, they only need limited revenue streams. And these are pretty good ways of doing it. I have no problem paying a tax stamp. I got no problem paying, a little bit more on, tariffs, as long as it's not a protective tariff. I don't mind paying for postage. If that supports the government to do its limited duties, this is all fine, and nobody's going to object to it. Had they tried to put an income tax in this, how many states would have ratified the Constitution?
Right.
So give the answer.
And it's interesting you bring up protective tariffs because Jefferson and Madison during their presidencies used tariffs quite a bit. And generally, a tariff can be and is protective in nature. But what you're referring to is a protective tariff in which it is designed.
It's designed to protect specific industries or entities.
Right, exactly. That was the complaint by Jefferson back in 1791 and 1790 when Hamilton was pushing protective tariffs.
Well, it was just like the Tea Act. The Tea Act basically put an extra tax on tea that wasn't shipped by the British East India Trading Company.
Right.
And that basically is crony capitalism. And we decided to throw that tea into a certain harbor.
Right.
And got a chance to, dress up as Indians. All right. To make rules and regulations for the collection thereof and the same from time to time to alter and amend in such manner as they shall think. This is all good stuff. To pass acts for the regulation of trade and commerce as well with foreign nations as with each other, provided that all punishments, fines, forfeitures, and penalties to be incurred for contravening such acts, rules, and regulations shall be adjudged by the common law judiciaries of the state in which any offense contrary to the true intent and meaning of such acts and rules and regulations shall have been committed or perpetrated, with liberty of commencing in the first place all suits and prosecutions for that purpose in a superior common law judiciary of such states, subject nevertheless for the correction of all errors, both in law and fact, in rendering judgment to an appeal to the judiciary of the United States.
Say that 5 times fast.
Yeah, you want to give us a one-sentence summary, because what they say there is correct. That they want the United States Congress to have the power to make laws and the federal judiciary to enforce laws if they're in the pursuit of, basically lawful regulation.
Yeah, and they haven't fully developed an understanding of Solon's words, Polybius's words, that Polybius being a Greek political philosopher, that the lawgivers must not be the law. The lawgivers must not be the lawmakers. The lawmakers must not be the lawgivers. In other words, separation of powers. They're still playing this. They're all gonna be like the Continental Congress, and it's just gonna be one big giant, parliamentarian style system. And the judges, by the way, are going to have all these powers, judicial review. And so they're still, right now, they're still dancing with that.
Yeah, I'm a little upset with Patterson. Really, this is one sentence. There's one semicolon dividing the whole thing. That is terrible, terrible English. It's not easy, I should say. I'm sure he's probably actually more educated in English than you and I combined, but because these guys, they were graduating Yale and Harvard at age 16.
Right. And we have to remember that these guys, once again, the finished product is not there yet. And hindsight is not there. We are looking at this with hindsight. They're trying to figure out what to do. A lot of these are not like demands. They're suggestions. They're saying, well, let's throw this at the wall and see if it sticks. Let's throw this at the wall. So understand that's what's going on here. So when we read through a lot of this, we're not necessarily seeing something that is set in stone or is going to make its way into the Constitution. They are, once again, throwing around ideas. And this is one of the reasons why after about the 5th week, Benjamin Franklin says, well, you know what? We really haven't gotten much done. We've resolved a few things, but ultimately, we're just throwing stuff around. We haven't gotten anything done, and we're debating and arguing and disagreeing so much that, we have a problem here. We'll get to this in the near future, but he's like, hey, we need to be at least somewhere on the same foundation.
Very good.
They're all over the place right now.
Okay. It's going to be another one of those paragraphs, so bear with me.
All right, so take a deep breath.
Resolved that whenever requisitions shall be necessary, instead of the rule for making requisitions mentioned in the Articles of Confederation, instead, so there's going to be a change, the United States and Congress be authorized to make such requisitions in proportion to the whole number of white and other free citizens and inhabitants of every age, sex, and condition. Well, let's stop right there. Of every age, sex, and condition. The age part's a little bit of an issue, but Doug, don't you make the point that women were never forbidden from voting?
No, they were never forbidden from voting, not nationally through the federal Constitution. The thing I actually popped in my head was what? There wasn't 72 genders there? Or is it 50 something or 80 something? I don't even know. But but no, actually, once the United States became a country, in 10 of the original 13 states, single women could vote if they could show a minimum of $50 worth of property. And when I say property, that doesn't necessarily mean real estate, but it could be anything tangible. Married women didn't vote because, well, when you marry, you become one. And the representative of that one is the husband. That's why married women didn't vote. But anyway, continue, please.
What they're saying here, and they get into the, Indians not taxed in 3/5 clause. These are talking about requisitions, which basically I believe is levies on the state because Congress needs money, and it should be. He says it's going to be based on population. The bigger
Right,
states,
and this is what ultimately became the income tax until the 16th Amendment. But the states were not. They could refuse it if they didn't like the budget. But that's what they're talking about. But and I want to point out something there at the end of that sentence. Except Indians not paying taxes. They're talking about apportionment also, and apportionment. So in other words, the number of citizens or inhabitants that determined by population how much of a requisition that the state would pay. The Indians weren't counted. These are people who live in the state, but they are subject to a foreign power. They're tribes. So they were not to be counted towards apportionment or towards the taxation part. Apportionment being the numbers of members that a state would have when it comes to the House of Representatives.
Yes, the balance. It's the balance. You're a bigger state. You're going to pay more in taxes, but you're going to get more voice in the House. And that's
the reason why I'm bringing this up is, except Indians not paying taxes, those in the United States but subject to a foreign power are not to be counted. Just
important point.
Just let me know if there's any other group today that kind of sounds like it's in the same category.
Okay, this next part, and I'm glad I stopped there because this is really important.
Okay. Read it carefully and slowly.
This is nullification. That if such requisitions, meaning demands for money, be not complied with in the time specified therein, to direct the collection thereof in the non-complying states, and for that purpose to devise and pass acts directing and authorizing the same. So, if a state hasn't paid what Congress asked for, provided that none of the powers hereby vested in the Congress shall be exercised without the consent of at least blank number of states. And in that proportion, if the number of Confederate states should hereafter be increased or diminished. This is an interesting proposal. It implies that the states have to approve congressional requisitions and perhaps even all bills altogether. And
if there's some that refuse to play along, if enough states say you have to, they have to.
Yeah, they haven't decided. New Jersey didn't know what that number should be, but it's a fascinating proposal, and it goes into a lot of subjects. So I'm glad we paused on that. You want to go deeper in that, or should I continue?
No, we're good. You explained it well.
Thanks.
Or we explained it well.
Blind squirrels, or not our first rodeos. Okay, resolved that the United States in Congress be authorized to elect a federal executive to consist of blank persons to continue in office for a term of blank years.
So we still haven't even decided if it's just going to be one president.
That's true. New Jersey is not sure about it.
Yeah.
Remember, I read the resolutions that have been passed. They have said it's a single unitary executive already. But that's still, some people are still arguing it. To receive punctually at stated times, fixed compensation. I hate the fact they go on for like that so much. Here it comes. To be incapable of holding any other office. To be ineligible a second time. So
no
only single term, no. Here. To be ineligible a second time and removable by Congress, and no 2 terms. And, of course, impeachment.
Yeah.
But they want removable by Congress on application by a majority of the executives of the several states. So the
governors.
Yeah. The governors have to get together and say, get rid of this president or presidents. And then the Congress can impeach. That the executive, besides their general authority to execute the federal acts, ought to appoint all federal officers, of course, not otherwise provided for, and to direct all military operations. Okay.
Now, when you read the Constitution later in its finished form, you're going to realize that this idea of the governors having say is drawn way back. They don't want the executives making decisions. They want the legislatures to make the decisions. Now, some of the provisions will say, however, that if the legislature cannot convene, then the governor will have that opportunity to make these decisions. But governors are not in the final copy of the Constitution given all these powers or these abilities. That once again, they're throwing stuff up against the wall, seeing what sticks. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I agree with that, by the way, with the decision they came to, because the governor is got a completely different role. You know, their role is to govern their state and follow their state constitution. He should not be paying attention to, more the international type thing or the national level, to the same degree that the legislature has to. It says, provided that none of the persons composing the federal executive shall on any occasion take command of any troops so as personally to conduct any enterprise as general or in other capacity. What is he saying there?
No, the governor can't just use the military. Now, the question is, were they considering at that time the militia as being the same? Because it says command of any troops. So in other words, should the governor not be commander-in-chief over his militia in his state? Is that what they're suggesting?
No, Doug, he's talking about right here. It says the federal executive. So he's not talking about the state governors.
Okay.
So shall take on any occasion, take command of any troops. So as to personally conduct any enterprise. Okay, that's where they're getting at.
Well, it says none of the persons, and so that's where I got screwed up. As I said persons, I'm thinking governors. That's right. They're still suggesting there could be more than one president.
I'm almost wondering if this is a Benedict Arnold clause. Think about that. As the military commander of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
That might be what he's thinking there, because that New Jersey was right next door to it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And once again, you got to remember that New Jersey, being a state with a smaller population, feels like they could be easily subject to I don't know if a tax is the right word, but influences from the other states. Their sovereignty is a big deal to them.
Okay. How are we doing on time right now? We are just about an hour in. I think we can probably get through. Yeah, we can get through all of it. Okay. This is the New Jersey plan continued. Resolved that a federal judiciary be established to consist of a supreme tribunal, which shall be appointed by the executive. Aha. The existing resolution said it be appointed by the Senate. But here's New Jersey saying, no, the president ought to be the one. This will be an interesting argument.
Yeah. Now, for those of you who are keeping a scorecard here, what ultimately happens is the executive appoints, but the Senate approves. Compromise. They both kind of, both plans kind of get their way there.
And to hold their office during good behavior, blah, 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 compensation. I'm not going to read all the compensation language because it takes forever and it's just saying the same thing. That the judiciary so established shall have authority to hear and determine in the first instance on all impeachments of federal officers, and by way of appeal in the dernier resort, that's the last resort, in all cases touching the rights of ambassadors, in all cases of captures from an enemy, in all cases of piracies and felonies, in all cases in which foreigners may be interested, in the construction of any treaties, or which may arise on any of the acts, regulation of trade, or the collection of the federal revenue. What's missing?
Yeah, except for the very first part, the rest of that is in place. And state and in cases in which a state is a party.
Yeah, that's
would
missing.
Be one of the things missing.
Yeah, it's also missing. It's none of your business if it's someone in your own state. They're not giving the federal judiciary a negative on state laws. They are not suggesting that.
Okay.
That none of the judiciary shall, during the time they remain in office, be capable of receiving or holding any other office. Okay, so we'll have this bookmark and we'll come back to this our fifth resolution from the New Jersey plan. That's going to come up again. It's resolved that all acts of Congress made by virtue and in pursuance of the powers hereby by the Articles of Confederation vested in them, and all treaties made and ratified under the authority of the U.S. shall be the supreme law of the respective states, so far forth as those acts or treaties shall relate to the said states or their citizens, and that the judiciary of several states shall be bound thereby in their decisions. Stop there.
Now, this is an ultimate supremacy clause. It says in pursuance of the powers hereby, but it doesn't say hereby of what? Just by the Articles of Confederation? Are we going further than that, deeper than that? It's still a little ambiguous on that part. So it reads in a manner that makes it sound like, so pretty much everything that the government does is going to be supreme.
Yeah, this is a nasty little resolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's the supremacy clause in Article 6, but they definitely tweaked it and changed things to make it better. But then it continues use that same clause in Article 6. So continue on. Anything
in the respective laws of the individual states to the contrary notwithstanding.
In other words, states cannot have laws contrary to federal law. Now, the federal law is supposed to be pursuant to the Articles of Confederation here, or at least that's the way it seems to be worded, but it doesn't lay it out plainly. Of course, Articles of Confederation is going to get dropped ultimately. It's going to be replaced by Constitution, and some of the language is going to change to make it clearer on what they mean.
Yeah, that's why if we were to sit down and rewrite the Constitution with the original intent, with the language in the preamble, I would think we would articulate the enumeration doctrine, making it crystal clear that we've enumerated which powers belong to the federal government and where they're supreme, and anything not listed there, the states have to go back to this.
And it's interesting because there are moments when Jefferson, as Secretary of State under Washington, first 2 years before the 10th Amendment exists, is using 10th Amendment principles, enumeration doctrine against Hamilton in their debates over the National Bank and other things. This idea of the 10th Amendment didn't just suddenly pop up with the Bill of Rights. And it did exist at this point. That's what they wanted, and they explain it ultimately later on during the convention. But in the beginning, it's not as clear-cut explained. Because once again, they're throwing stuff against the wall. They're still trying to figure out what they want to do here.
Yeah. Well, this resolution number 6 stinks to high heaven in my world.
Yes, it does.
And that if any state or any body of men in the state shall oppose or prevent something carrying into execution such acts or treaties, the federal executive shall be authorized to call forth ye power of the Confederated States, or so much thereof as may be necessary to enforce and compel an obedience to such acts or an observance of such treaties.
That gives the president way too much power.
Yep. Full force. Oh, you're not listening to what Congress said? Send in the troops. That's what New Jersey wants here.
Yeah.
There's good parts of this New Jersey proposal, but that's not one of them.
Right.
If I had an eraser, this whole paragraph I'd just nuke off the page because it stinks. All right, number 7. And notice they're not addressing everything that's already been resolved. This is all they had time for on their Wednesday lunch.
Yeah, and there's going to be more from the New Jersey plan ultimately.
Oh yeah, there is, and some of it's going to be good. Resolved that provision may be made for the admission of new states into the Union. Okay, sounds reasonable. Resolved the rule for naturalization ought to be the same in every state.
That's in Article 1, Section 8, and that's exactly what they wind up putting as a uniform rule for for naturalization. Shall be power of Congress establishing those rules.
Did you read the writ of certiorari submitted today by Trump's DOJ in the birthright citizenship case?
No.
Hey, that came out today. I sometime this weekend. I highly recommend you do so, and I think you'll end up smiling quite a bit.
Good, because I was frowning over what I was reading over some of Oregon's gun laws coming up.
Yeah, this one they did a pretty darn good job. I got to hear. Well, I didn't get to the entire thing, but what I've heard so far, pretty good. They're not taking it to the. They're not pushing the limit. They're just asking for. They really cited Young Kim Ark really well. So we'll talk about that next week after you had a chance to digest it. But I was pleased. I think it came out yesterday or today.
Okay.
but it's a really good drafted document. It's argued well, and I think Supreme Court's going to. I'd be willing to bet that they get it right or partially right. They are not asking for retroactive birthright citizenship yet, and I think that's strategic. All right, finishing this up. Resolved that a citizen of one state committing an offense in another state shall be deemed guilty of the same offense as if it had been committed by a citizen of the state in which the offense was committed. This is important.
Full faith and credit, Article 4.
Yes, and it's very important because what was going on is you're jumping state lines and to escape justice.
Yeah.
And that would be a problem for quite some time. This even ties into the fugitive slave law. So this is actually very important. And I think it's the first time that this was mentioned in this whole process, unless my memory is failing me.
Yeah, what was happening was basically a founding era version of the Dukes of Hazzard. You know, once you get across the border, you're safe. Of course, the Dukes of Hazzard lied to you, and radio calls are faster than any cop car anyway. But full faith and credit, which comes from Article 4, basically says that, you know, your crimes, your certificates, your judgments against you, any certificates that you may acquire or licenses, all of that is going to be recognized in each state, and extradition then is possible.
So we don't normally go into the footnotes, but this was a very interesting one, footnote number 4.
Okay.
This plan has been concerted among the deputations of more members thereof from Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and perhaps Mr. Martin from Maryland. He had made with them a common cause on different principles. Connecticut and New York were against a departure from the principles of the Confederation. Okay. Wishing rather to add a few new powers to Congress than to substitute a national government. Interesting statement there. The states of New Jersey and Delaware were opposed to a national government because its patrons considered a proportional representation of the states as the basis of it. Small states were opposed to a national government. Remember,
national government nationalism means an umbrella, basically overpowering federal system, national system, should I say, that runs everything. No chance of state sovereignty having any say. A federal system, as opposed to a national system, would be where the powers given to the federal government are limited. The states held a lot of the powers. Now, that said, the term national government would ultimately often be used by many of these delegates as a synonym for federal government. But ultimately, truly, the two are very different.
This next sentence, remember, this is early Madison, not changed Madison talking.
Right.
The eagerness displayed by the members opposed to a national government from these different motives began now to produce serious anxiety for the result of the convention. Mr. Do you want me to just leave that hanging there? Because that was
no. Go ahead, keep reading. I think this will help answer it.
Mr. Dickinson said to Mr. Madison, "You see the consequence of pushing things too far. Some of the members from the small states wish for 2 branches in the general legislature and are friends to a good national government. But we would sooner submit to a foreign power than submit to be deprived of an equality of suffrage in both branches of the legislature, and thereby be thrown under the domination of the large states."
This is a real fear by the smaller states to be dominated by the larger states and become a national government controlled by the larger states.
Yeah, and it really, as bad as the 17th Amendment is, the small states still get their 2 senators. So they didn't go all the way, even though they made it democratically elected. With Reynolds v. Sims, they went all the way. Not only did they make state senators democratically elected, but they took away the basically representation of the smaller counties.
And there are some politicians nowadays who are arguing that the U.S. Senate should also be proportional like the House. There was a particular one, Pelosi, one time, remember this years ago, complaining that North Dakota had the same voting power as New York, and that Wyoming had the same voting power as California, and that's just not democratic. And so, there are ideas to more further dismantle what few Republican form of government mechanisms we still have in place. 2 senators per state being one of them, electoral college being another, the states ratifying any amendments being another. And I think those are the last of our Republican mechanisms, to be honest with you.
Well, the reason we do what we do is to get this pendulum swing in the other direction. And we're working towards that. I've got a lot, when we get a chance to talk next week, I got a lot of stuff going on this front, especially the Reynolds v. Sims front. I want to get you caught up and actually read in on some of these conversations. But we'll do that offline. That's probably good for today. A very productive day, or 3 days in the convention, but it was a fun one, wasn't it?
You had to wait a little while, but I'm back. I've got one more trip before the end of the year, the last week of October, and a little bit into the first week of, I think it's a week and a half trip in November. Aside from that, I'm here for the rest of the year.
Real quick, where can they find you?
DouglasVGibbs.com, DouglasVGibbs.com. And I also have a second site I set up because I've got some listings of certain things on it that I want people to still be able to find. So navigation2liberty.com. That's navigation, the number 2, liberty.com, navigation2liberty.com, DouglasVGibbs.com. Yes, I haven't posted in a while. I am posting at ConnectCanadaFreePress.com. Check out those articles. Once DouglasVGibbs.com gets resolved, and according to Warhamster here, hopefully by Monday I'll be able to start posting again. Then you'll start seeing stuff pop up on that site all the more. And of course, I am on the air all over the place. Matter of fact, Fridays at 2 at Patriot Soapbox, Sundays at 5. This is Pacific time, Patriot Soapbox. And then, of course, KMET 1490 AM at 1 o'clock Pacific. And the San Diego stations, K-Praise, KCBQ on Saturday nights at 8 p.m. Pacific. And that one is also on all the podcast channels. Just type in Mr. Constitution Hour by Douglas V. Gibbs. And, of course, we have our ZakiRadio.com shows on Wednesdays and Thursdays.
Yeah, we're going to try to pick up the pace here on Madison's Notes. I'd like to be able to do 2 episodes a week. Keep it about 60 minutes, but we ought to be able to get through because it really is getting interesting. And again, that last footnote today was just, really summed up what's going on. And
yeah,
this is fun stuff, people, and it's really important. And I'm glad Doug and his lovely wife got to take a nice vacation and head to Arkansas and all that, and give a wonderful speech in Lake Havasu, where he was nice enough to mention me, and I was flattered.
Yeah. Well, the Arkansas thing was huge because my mom and dad lived there. I love my mom, but just like anything, Benjamin Franklin was correct. Visitors are like fish. After about 3 days, they begin to stink. And we were at my mom's 3 days, and I love my mom, don't get me wrong, but I was ready to move on.
I'm not touching that one. With no further ado, thanks everybody for watching. Until the next time, cheers.